Hello young and old, friends and foes, welcome back to the channel. We're gonna put together this Omega 1020 again today. You might remember last time when we looked at it, we had these two gaskets that had been integrated into this tar-like substance. So before we do that, let's just have a nice cup of coffee. Oh, that must be Colombian bean. I think it's gonna take quite a few sugar cubes to make that one taste sweet. So what's inside this jar is Elma cleaning solution for ultrasonics. 1 to 9, you mix 1 part of that with 9 parts of water. And it's very effective, as you might already have guessed from the color of it. It wasn't that color initially, it was pretty much transparent. So if we try to scrape a little gently on this with tweezers, we see that most of it is indeed gone. But just to make very sure that everything is clean, I'm going to put it into a new jar of clean 1 to 9 solution, run it through the ultrasonic again, and then everything should be spick and span. Yeah, that looks a lot better. So this is the solution jar after running it through the ultrasonic. Now we can actually see the parts, so that's good. Happy with that. So let's turn now to the barrel. You might remember last time we said we would put in a new mainspring. So the first thing we have to do is to grease the barrel wall using this Kleber grease. We have the new mainspring. For most watches, Swiss most of all, the colored side should be up when you put this in. For most non-Swiss watches, it's the other way around. Put in the barrel arbor. And these barrel arbor lid closer little tiny tools are actually quite useful. They say that's an app for everything, but for watchmaking there's a tool for everything. Of course, most of those tools are made in Switzerland, the high quality ones, and they are somewhat pricey. Yes, Spurgeon, I'm looking at you. We picked up the barrel bridge. You might remember this construction where they have this wigwag wheel that screws into this rectangular or quadratic piece underneath. Can be a bit tricky to get in place. So using some Swiss Play-Doh is always good for this. When talking about the tools being pricey, or at least the Swiss ones, yes, of course they are. But Switzerland is pricey. I moved to Switzerland quite recently from the Netherlands, where I lived for a long time. I'm from Norway, but still. I mean, Norway is pricey, but Switzerland is maybe even pricier. Half a kilo of minced meat costs like 10 francs. Houses are like 2-3 times more expensive. So of course, when the expense level is this high, then income levels need to be very high as well. So maybe a easy to understand measure. A McDonald's employee in Switzerland will earn about 50,000 francs, which is like 55,000 US dollars per year. A single person in Switzerland who earns less than about 27,000 francs, so about 30,000 US dollars, would be considered below the poverty line. Simply because renting a room or a house is incredibly expensive. So that is why it's very expensive to buy Swiss tooling. But then again, of course, the quality is very high. And it's always better to buy good ones than cheap several times. Alright, well, we've been speaking about non-relevant issues. We've started assembling the watch. And this time we started with the barrel and the barrel bridge. Could have started with the train first, or keyless works for that sake. One thing to note here is that we need to make sure that this little spring in the main plate meshes with this wigwag wheel for the winding. And we're also going to put a little bit of D5 or similar on the base of these wheels. Another thing is also that a lot of these screws actually look very similar. So it's a good idea to keep them in one place or take a lot of pictures so you don't mix them up. It's actually a very common thing to mix up screws. If the threads are the same but the heads are different, then that's not too difficult to do. That's why I personally like to put the screws together with the other parts of one element of the watch. Let's say the keyless works. I put all those parts together in one section in the tray. And then just keep the screws there. Alright, let's put the rest of the train together as well. We can put the train bridge on and see if it moves freely. There is one plastic part that we need to put in before we put the train bridge on. And that's the stop lever or the hack. It looks like there's a screw hole there, so you might be tempted to put a screw in, but there isn't actually. One note I should make here, that it's probably better to start the train assembly with a second pinion, because it's a little bit fiddly to get in when you have all the other train wheels in place. But somehow I always seem to do it this way. It works, it's just a little bit more fiddly. And fiddly might perhaps be one of the keywords when looking up this movement in Google or whatever. I don't know what's with this competition for the smallest screws in the world, but the 1000 series is definitely a contender. I mean, who makes bridge screws with a yellow screwdriver? Seriously. And just for reference, if you're not familiar with the colors of the watchmaker screwdrivers, 0.80 millimeters. That's the yellow screwdriver head size. So these screws are about that size, perhaps slightly bigger. Oh, a little magnetism. We flipped the watch over to the dial side. We're going to put together the keyless works. Put some grease on the sliding pinion and the winding pinion first. Also going to put some grease behind the winding pinion where it might rub against the shoulders of that cutout there. We talked a little bit last time about this movement, or the series of movements, the 1000 series, which includes the 1010 and the 1020 and also the 1030. So this was the last in-house movement series that Omega made before recent years, when they started up with coaxial calipers and that type of thing. Some might also say that it's not really in-house because it's eta that actually makes it for omega, but then again omega and eta are part of the same group, and it's clear that omega do design their own movements, and of course their new movements, the 88, 50 and so forth, are fantastic movements. But the 1000 series was the last real in-house movement that omega made, and I'm not counting quartz, of course. I would rather eat my own leg with the nails and some hair, raw even, maybe with some soy sauce, maybe some seaweed and rice. But I will do that before I start talking about quartz watches, okay? But the 1000 series was indeed the last of the, let's say, true in-house movements from Omega. And that's also why it has a bit of a bad reputation. You'll find some people saying that watches with the 1000 series movements aren't collectible. And that's complete rubbish, of course. I would say quartz watches aren't collectible. Smart watches aren't collectible, but an Omega mechanical watch will always be collectible. So let me just clarify what I mean by collectible in this context. So collectible in the sense that it will always be able to run. You'll always be able to repair it. Of course, smartwatches and quartz watches depend on technology that will be outdated and non-replaceable. While mechanical watches, at least vintage ones, are basically just metal, different pieces of metal. And apparently some plastic. Shame on you, Omega 1000 series. But to get back to what I was actually planning to talk about, it was a little bit of a perfect storm in a lot of ways for Omega with this 1000 series. Of course, quartz was making a big intro. It was very expensive to make mechanical watches comparatively. The design of the 70s is less desirable in most people's eyes nowadays than, let's say, older watches or even newer ones. So all these things together make that the total watch that has these movements inside it will be probably less attractive to a lot of people. So I would say it's the complete picture that might make some of these 70s watches less valued than older watches. So just to conclude that, I don't think it's entirely fair to say that the 1000 series was the downfall of Omega's mechanical watches or anything like that. It is, of course, a fantastic movement compared to most other manufacturers' movements. It has its quirks and some weaknesses and ridiculously small screws. But yeah, it is still Omega. Still very attractive watches made with these movements inside. Oh, I almost feel bad now for Omega 1000 series. But whenever that happens, I think of Omega 1030. If you really want to hate an Omega movement, please hate the 1030. That is the manual wind version of the 1000 series. What they did was to simply replace the automatic module with just an empty plate on top. So when you take it off, there's nothing underneath, which is of course a cost-efficient way of doing it. Given the onslaught from quartz, I'm sure that played into that decision, but it's still very ugly. Anyway, we gotten the keyless works back together. Oiled everything, greased everything. Let's just check if it works. Talked a little bit last time about this date corrector yoke. That's the one with this star wheel looking thingy. We'll revisit that later. Let's put on this snap on, as they call it, cannon pinion for the third wheel. This is not intended to slip. So there is an actual cannon pinion in this movement. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail when we get there. First now we can turn the movement over to the train side again. Put a little bit oil in the barrel. Then we can put on the rest of the motion works. And when I'm looking at these pictures, I think also part of what makes the 1000 series less loved is that it also has this sort of industrial look and feel to it. Just less refinement. So if you compare it to the 550 series, it just looks less loved in a sense. Looks like they put less effort perhaps, or yeah, love, I think, into making it. Let's get the pallet fork back on, the pallet fork bridge. Off camera I soaked that one in Fix-A-Drop. I also didn't show this time, by the way, the cleaning of the shock settings. Been showing that in a lot of other videos, so you can look at those for reference if you want. And speaking of other videos, if you like these videos, please click like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. The thing is, there's an algorithm, of course, on YouTube that helps people find videos they might like. And the more likes, views, and subscriptions a channel has, the more recommendations it will get. Putting in the second pinion. As mentioned before, it's probably a better idea to do this before you put on the rest of the train. It's just a little bit less fiddly that way. But when you have the rock steady hands of a brain surgeon, then it's not an issue anyway, of course. Or if you can simply edit your YouTube videos slightly. Speaking of editing, I also did miss out showing a couple of oiling things. The second pinion, for instance, there was a little shoulder on it that we want to oil that I didn't show. But as mentioned before, basically everywhere something rubs against something else, you want to have a little bit of oil or grease. And to know whether it should be oil or grease is not too complicated typically. If it's fast running things, you want a light oil. If it's slowly running things, you want a thicker oil. If it's very high pressure, like things that do not really rotate, but like press against each other, like levers and pushers and keyless works, that type of thing, then you use a grease. Okay, we're getting the balance in place. And if you want it to actually run, it's probably a good idea to put some power on the mainspring, or in other words, to wind the watch a little bit. Coincidentally, I had a customer recently who bought a very nice Seamaster DeVille, and he put it aside and it stopped after a couple of days, and he was a little bit scared what could have happened. Turned out he was, of course, not used to mechanical watches, so we had a good laugh about that. What I also haven't showed you, which I've promised a few times now that I should show, is the oiling of the pallet stones, or rather the greasing. When you have a high-speed caliber, basically 28-800 or higher, then you use a grease on the pallet stones. If it's a lower beat movement, you would use an oil. And the reasoning is that with a high beat movement, the pallet fork will also, of course, move a lot faster back and forth. So the lower the viscosity of whatever you put on the pallet fork, the more it will splash off. Okay, we're going to assemble the automatic module. Relatively similar to the 550 family. Again, the long end of these pinions sticks down from where we see it now. But when working on these movements, make sure you use your phone to take a lot of pictures. And the thing is, the person working before you on the movement might not have done things right either. So the best thing to do is try to find the tech guides, tech sheet, tech manual, whatever you call it. They're available a lot of places online, forums, on websites, material houses. And watchguide.co.uk is a really good resource. Not only are they very skilled at their work, but they also have a very good library of tech manuals, lift angles, mainspring types, that kind of thing. So absolutely worth visiting watchguide.co.uk. We oiled the automatic module on the underside, so we can put it back. Put a little bit of force on the crown, so it slips into place. And then we can screw it down and oil the top side of it as well. It also means that we put together the timekeeping part of the watch. So we can put it on the time grapher and adjust it. Now, this is not a chronometer version of the series. Also interesting perhaps to note that Omega had this convention where the 0 at the end of a movement would typically mean that it's a 17 joule version made for export, because for instance the US has a higher tariff on 17 and above number of joules. So we're seeing that it's running a bit too fast. That's not a problem, we can adjust that. And the beat error is not bad. 0.1 is perfectly acceptable. The amplitude is actually slightly on the high side, but as long as the lines are straight, that's okay. Let's speed up this adjustment a little bit. What we want to achieve is a straight line, basically. For an automatic movement, we're happy if the timekeeping is between, let's say, 0 and 3 seconds plus. See that the graph is a little bit irregular. That can happen for a few different reasons. One is typically that the microphone on the time grapher is not picking it up properly. So we can replace the watch on the time grapher microphone, and then you'll get a smoother line. So see, the ultimate outcome of the adjustment looks pretty good. Let's now revisit what we promised to do before. We talked a little bit about the date corrector yoke, this star-wheeled 3-wheel thingy, and the Conan pinion. So the Conan pinion has also sometimes been called Conan the Destroyer. No, sorry, should be Cannon the Destroyer. Or rather, Cannon the Destroyer! Take it out! So the Cannon pinion on the 1000 series is really the destroyer of the date corrector yoke. And it specifically destroys this little wheel on the underside that we see in this shot here. I'm going to try to hold it still and zoom in a little bit. Yeah, that's good. Hold it still there. Hold it. Hold it. So the wheel, as you can see, has very small teeth. And the material is not adamantium or unobtainium. So what happens if there's too much friction in the Cannon pinion is that when you twist the crown wheel will shred these teeth right off. And then you have a problem. Omega recommends that you replace the Cannon pinion, but obviously it's not so easy to come across Cannon pinions for this movement anymore. So what we're going to do instead is to disassemble the Cannon pinion. So we have to make sure that the Cannon pinion wheel is held down flat. So a crown gauge like this is good for that. Then we can use a pin vise around the tube and pull it straight up. I'm sure there are other methods for doing this also, but this one works well. When we have the tube off, of course, we clean the two parts very well and put on some D5 when we reassemble it. And the friction of this cannon pinion should be lighter than what you're used to when you think of cannon pinions. So if you test this by using the same pin vise, then it should rotate pretty freely. Obviously with friction, but still quite freely. Alright, we cleaned it, put on some D5, or HB 1300 to be precise, and then we can put it into the movement. The dial side of the movement is relatively straightforward. It's a pretty logical design. Perhaps the one thing that is the most interesting is that there's one jumper for both the weekday disc and the date disc. That's this rather chunky jumper that we'll see in a second. Here also there are screws with the same thread but different lengths and heads. So we always want to make sure we use the right screw. That's also why we obsessively test the parts that should move freely actually do move freely. If the screw is too short, this one would be tight, for instance, and that's not how it's supposed to be. So this is the double function jumper that I mentioned. You see this thicker inner part is the one that meshes with the weekday star wheel underneath the disc. It's actually not necessary to put the spring on there. Put the hour wheel on, and then before we put the date disc on, let's have a look at this plate that holds everything down. It's called the date indicator guard. And that one has the date corrector wheel on top with this little spring that puts it on a little bit of pressure. That spring sits pretty nicely in that slot, so you can put it on before you put the guard on or the plate on. But you can of course also put the plate on before you put the spring on. Doesn't really matter as long as the wheel is put in place, because that fits into that little slot with like a key lock mechanism. And we can put the date disc on, make sure the jumper is in between two teeth, and then we can put this plate on. And this plate has 3 screws to hold it down. I think these screws were all entered into the World Championship for small screw size at the time. I think they also placed very, very high. Eminently pingable screws. And again, to make sure you don't ping things, hold them very lightly. Okay, we're almost finished with the watch now. Last thing we need to do is to make sure that this plate is properly screwed down, and we can put the weekday disc on. But as always, for every major step we do in a watch, we want to test that what we did works. And what we can see is that this weekday corrector wheel, this bronze wheel, rotates in both directions, which it shouldn't. But don't worry, the guys in Omega thought of this. So when the weekday disc is in place, then the friction from the wheel, the jumper and the spring will make sure that this wheel only rotates in one direction. Alright, that looks good. Let's get the weekday disc on. The best way to get it in place is to gently press it down and rotate it. Otherwise you can also use like a broken oiler. And this one is also held down with a couple of micro screws. So the reason you're seeing just my blurred fingers here is that I'm using both hands to actually steady the screwdriver. They're very small screws. We don't want to slip and scratch the movement or destroy the discs in this case. So that's a good tip, even if your hands are generally steady. Alright, testing time again. Let's turn the hands through midnight. So the way this movement is constructed, both the weekday and the date move around midnight, but we're going to use the date to set the hands to midnight for. So we can put the dial back on, screw it down. And I'm pretty sure I said this in the last video, but when the dial screws are the biggest screws in the movement, something is really weird about the design. And just for reference, I think the dial screws are 1 millimeter. Okay, let's test again. Date quick change works. Weekday quick change works. Okay. Then we can turn through midnight, so we can put the hands on. Again, we're going to follow the date. So when the date jumps, we know it's midnight. Then we can put the hour hand to 12. Wait for it, wait for it, wait for it. Yeah. Not going to show the exact process now of putting the hands on. You can see that in some of the other videos. But we first put the hour hand to midnight, as shown after the date jumps. Then we check that it actually crosses midnight when the date jumps. Then we can put the minute hand on, do the same thing. Also check that the hands are parallel with the dial, do not rub on anything. And when we're happy with that, the date should change, let's say 5 minutes to or fro, midnight. Yeah. Then we can put the seconds hand on. And the dial is in, which is in very nice condition. This is also an almost 50-year-old watch. But as I mentioned in the first part, presentation watches are often very well kept. They're an item of pride, of course, for their owners. If you remember, the crystal of the watch was quite scratched. And this case has a tension ring crystal, so there's no bezel holding it down. What we need to do is find the right size of die that goes almost around the edges of this tension ring crystal. That way, when you press on it against the case, the crystal will be slightly compressed, just enough to get into the case. And just to protect the case and the crystal, we put on this piece of cloth and the plastic. And we should hear a snap when the crystal fits into the case. And we should also inspect to make sure that the crystal is properly and uniformly down into the case. Before we put the case with the crystal on, we want to make sure there's no debris inside the crystal. So we use some Rollico there to clean that off. This movement has a case ring as well. put the stem in. And I'm pretty sure there's one of you who has been looking at this ratchet wheel for a long time and been seeing the spot there. So I saw it also. Alright, final thing to do, let's put the rotor on. One thing that can happen with this movement is that the rotor post becomes worn. That is not the case here. It is actually a pretty sturdy rotor post on the 1000 series, but still. So as we're coming towards the end of this video, I've been of course talking a lot about the reputation of the 1000 series. I do think it is actually a very good movement, but it has some weird design decisions basically. But it gives very good performance. And there are a lot of watches out there with this series movement. And even though Omega says in the tech guide, and I'm quoting here, if this new caliber presents obvious similarities to caliber 1000, it has nevertheless been entirely reconceived and can in no way be compared with it. Sure, Omega. But as mentioned in the first part, they were just really eager to distance themselves from caliber 1000. Okay, case back, new gasket, put some silicone on. Now, as an inhabitant of planet Earth, I have installed my fair share of IKEA furniture over the years, and I have frequently found that I have parts left over. For a watch, if you have any screws or anything left in the tray when you're finished assembling it, you should probably reconsider. So for the eagle-eyed viewer, I did go back and I did install the case screws. Also put a little silicone on the crown tube, so we don't have that squeaky sound anymore. And you can see I already put a strap on the watch. This is actually a Stingray strap. It's from a Stingray I killed with my own 2 hands and teeth last summer when I vacationed in Norway. It was him or me. Actually it was her, I think, but you know, from my experience that only makes them tougher, whether that be Stingrays or humans. Alright, we're just testing that everything works as it should, and it seems to do so. With the watch on the wrist, I think it looks quite dashing. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this video and this channel, please like and subscribe. And until the next time, you can find us on social media, on our own webpage or on Chrono24. Thanks so much for watching, and until shortly.